If you got married, would you get a prenuptial agreement? Today, I'm getting into my experience getting a prenup with my husband this year. This is one of those relationship and marriage topics that I wish more people talked about. By the way, if you're new, I'm Talia. I'm the host of the podcast Dating Intentionally, and I'm here to help you date more confidently so you can actually enjoy the process. And part of that includes developing the skills to not be scared to bring up what's important to you in marriage, like considering a prenup. Just in case you have no idea what a prenup is, a prenuptial agreement allows couples to establish their own terms for asset and debt division, which overrides the state default community property rules. This means you can specify how premarital assets and what you acquired during your marriage will be handled in the event of a divorce. Please keep in mind that I am not a financial expert, and if you're thinking about getting a prenup, definitely continue to do your own research and get professional input and support before moving forward. This is all based on my experience, which is purely anecdotal, so take it with a grain of salt. Also, keep in mind that I got married in California, so that is what I'm mostly going to talk about is getting a prenup in California specifically. I'm also happy to answer questions below, but just keep this in mind. So, I'm excited to talk about this process because personally, none of my married friends or family members went through this prenup process, which honestly surprises me, especially for people who I know who got married a second time. I would say that about half my friends are married at this point and none of them have a prenup. When I asked them about it, most of them said they didn't even consider it, and some said they only thought about it like a week before their wedding. Knowing that the rate of divorce is still pretty significant these days, that just really surprised me. I knew a prenup was a non negotiable for me no matter what. My parents got divorced when I was in high school, and it took them a long time to finalize it because of the financial part. Since I was about 16 at the time, I was very aware of what was happening when they split, and it seemed extremely hard on both my parents. I obviously can't get into the details here, but I think a prenup would have saved them both a lot of headaches, heartaches, and lawyer fees. I see a prenup like having a good health insurance plan. Like, I hope I never break a bone or have some medical emergency, but if I happen to need it, I'm glad I have it. Like, for example, I had a major surgery last year that would have cost me nearly $30,000 out of pocket, but it only cost me 150 bucks thanks to insurance. My intention with getting a prenup was to have a similar purpose if we decide to get divorced down the line. I am all in on my relationship and I'm fully dedicated to making it work. But as a child of divorced parents who probably felt the same in the beginning of their marriage, you just don't know how things are going to play out in the future. Also, I take marriage very seriously. When you get married, it's not just about love, romance, and commitment. You are becoming a family unit, and marriage is also a legal contract. You're tying yourselves together financially, so to me, a prenup just makes sense. Finally, it's important to know that if you don't get a prenup, state laws will dictate how your money is divided in divorce. I think getting a prenup is smart because it lets you create your own plan for how your assets and income will be treated during the marriage and in the case of a divorce. Many people don't realize that a prenup doesn't just apply what you bring to the marriage, it also covers what you earn and acquire during the marriage. For example, I live in California, which is a community property state. That means automatically, by default, everything is shared equally. But that wasn't what we wanted. By having a prenup, we were able to take control and decide how our finances would be handled instead of leaving it up to state laws. As an entrepreneur and business owner, I knew having a prenup was important to me long before I met my husband. And I got a bunch of questions about this on Instagram that I'm going to go through. Let's start with, how did you bring it up? So I remember bringing up having a prenup when my husband and I first started having serious conversations about marriage, maybe 7 to 9 months into our relationship, when we were also discussing moving in together because it was all kind of related. To me, moving in together meant we were going to get married, or at least we were on that track. My husband wasn't phased at all by the idea of a prenup. His parents are divorced too, and they each had several marriages. And I don't think he would have brought it up on his own. Like, it wasn't that important to him, but he understood the logic behind it and knew it was a non negotiable for me. I think due to my family situation, my pragmatic outlook on life, and logical approach to long term relationships, my husband knew this wasn't really about like a trust issue. It was more about control. Ultimately, we decided to keep our finances completely separate, other than the joint account, which we use for household stuff and joint expenses that we contribute to equally for now. My advice for bringing it up is to really dig into why this is important and do your best to stress how much you don't intend on ever using it, right? It truly is a worst case scenario safety net in the event that 10, 15 years, 20 years down the line, something happens and you want to end the marriage with the least amount of stress and animosity as possible. I also suggest bringing it up only if you're seriously considering marriage, right? There's no reason to bring it up if you're not actually going to go down that path. It also doesn't have to just be one conversation. You can bring it up Put it down, pick it up again later, and just kind of talk through it. You can also talk through it with a couples therapist, which is absolutely a good option if there's some tension around this topic. It's not a comfortable topic. You have to also remember there are just many ways to look at a marriage, right? One side is the romantic commitment, like lovey dovey side. The other side is just the brass tacks, like legal contract side of things. So when you're discussing a prenup, it's more about that. It's less about the love and the relationship. It's more just like we're legally binding ourselves together. Maybe we should have some kind of document that dictates what we're going to do if we want to end that contract. So, when do you actually start the process? Well, let's just assume you're having these discussions, you want to get married. We started the process 6 months before our wedding date, and we were still very much down to the wire because it took longer than we thought to each find lawyers. And yes, in this process for California, you each have to get your own lawyer. In total, I spent about $2,500 on my lawyer fees, and my husband's costs were a little lower because my lawyer drafted it and his just reviewed it. And that's kind of how it worked. And look, we did look at cheaper services like Hello Prenup, but we thought they were too risky since they're so new. Prenups often get tossed out in court for various reasons, and we wanted to be as buttoned up as possible. Yeah, lawyers are expensive, but the idea, I guess, is that if you spend money on a prenup and then you get divorced, you'll spend less on lawyers through that process since you've already decided what you want to do, when you still like each other. Another question I got was, do you need one if you have? I don't think anyone will ever say you need a prenup. But for us, my husband and I make roughly the same amount of money per year so far with maybe like a $10,000 difference. And that's just how it happened. We also have very similar amounts in investments and retirement, which I'm proud of because I'm a few years younger. But again, for me, this prenup was more about the wealth we're each building during the marriage, not what we're coming into with. I'm going to get into some of the questions and topics that we have to talk about during the process. And I think even if you don't get a prenup, these topics are worth talking about. Like you can still go through the motions, even if you don't sign the agreement and get the document, like have these conversations. Another question I got was, where do you start and can you make one yourself or do you need a lawyer? I mean, I think getting a lawyer is a must here if you want to have a legitimate prenup agreement that holds up in court. And again, you want to look at what your state laws say, but in California, you each need your own lawyer to make it work. In terms of where to start, I think first have discussions about whether or not you want one and why. Then, when you've made your decision, one of you can engage a lawyer who specializes in family or divorce law. And in my experience, I was guided through the process thanks to my lawyer. And I did talk to a few lawyers to see, what their prices were and kind of who I gelled with. And they helped me through the whole process. We had to get all of our assets together. This took a very long time. We had to get together all our statements for bank accounts, retirement accounts, credit card and checking accounts, assets like cars, furniture, family heirlooms, HSA accounts. Basically any financial account that you have goes into it, at least in California. Again, you have to look up what's required in your state and a lawyer will also, help you through that process and tell you what to do to make it happen. What is included in a prenup? Well, prenups can address so many different financial aspects, but some examples are, again, premarital assets. So, what you are coming into the marriage with and how you will divide that if you are divorced. Marital earnings, that's going to be how what you earn during the marriage will be treated. Debt, so that's going to be allocating responsibility for debts that you have before and during the marriage. And of course, spousal supports. So that's like setting terms for alimony. And, courts will usually review those provisions for fairness, but that's going to be in there too. So, to talk through what we wanted in our prenup, we spent a few hours really discussing these difficult topics and questions. And these are not the kind of things we normally talk about at all. It was tough. And we literally pulled this random questionnaire off Google, and I'll link it below because it was pretty thorough. Here are some of the things that we had to talk about. We talked about how we're handling money earned in our marriage, and that includes everything from income to inheritance to capital gains and everything. We decided we're keeping everything separate on paper and we're not commingling finances. We talked about what we'll do financially in terms of spousal support if we get divorced. We talked about how we'll manage medical expenses. Obviously, property is part of this conversation, but we don't own any homes or anything. And if we did, obviously, a prenup is very useful. We had to lay out exactly how we'd end our marriage if we decide to end it, like what counts as officially ending the marriage or entering into a separation. You have to talk about a date that your prenup will expire if you want it to, how you'll handle debt together, how you'll handle household finances together. There's a whole section for kids, and of course, how you'll handle attorney's fees in the event of a divorce. And again, these conversations, like these kind of tougher, not fun conversations, was the most important piece of the entire process. Even if you decide not to have a prenup, have these conversations. Like, what are you going to do about medical expenses? What are you going to do if you have kids and one of you stops working? How are you going to handle debt? And how are you going to manage household expenses together? Who's responsible for what and how will expenses be paid? When will you join finances together completely or keep them separate? These are the kinds of topics that you need to get into before tying the knot, whether you have a prenup or not. So we got married in September, and overall, I'm really glad we went through this process, even though it's not fun to talk about what happens if you split up. I think it's important to not ignore this potential outcome of a marriage, which no one wants or hopes for, but it does happen. I think this process helped me really internalize the weight of marriage and what we were deciding to do and how serious it is. Like, if anything, it made me take the entire process way more seriously and consider it more carefully, which is a good thing. Marriage is just not just about the wedding, it's not just about the ring, right? It's the whole thing. It's the whole how you're really being tied together. It's a big decision, and who you marry can affect your finances for the rest of your life. So what do you think? Would you get a prenup? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments and keep the discussion going. I hope you found this video helpful. Give it a thumbs up if you did, and make sure to subscribe for more dating advice every week. And of course, don't miss the podcast for more advice, tips, and insights for dating intentionally. I'll see you next time.